I am so excited to be interviewing and talking to Souad Mekhennet, the Washington Post journalist. She is a personal hero of mine. In her book, I Was Told to Come Alone, My Journey Behind the Lines of Jihad is an epic read, and I highly suggest that all of you go and pick up a copy of her book. I think it's so relevant to what's happening in the world today, politically and socially, especially if you're an Arab or a Muslim, or especially if you're interested in Islam and what it means to be Muslim today. The book is a memoir of her life as a young Muslim living in Germany and Morocco, and then her life as a reporter covering some of the most dangerous regions of the world and talking to terrorists and writing about the effects of terrorism, not only in the Middle East, but its effects in the West. So today I'm going to talk to her about her life as a journalist, the process of writing this book, and the reaction she's gotten since it's been published. I'm also very interested to get her input and her perspective on this idea of what a terrorist is, and the idea of how we as Arab and Muslims need to bridge the gap between the perception of terrorism and what we actually are. First of all, I want to say that I managed to read your book a couple of months ago, 2 months ago. I got an advanced copy and I loved it. I think it's a really important book to be existing right now. I think not only is it important from a journalistic point of view, but I think from a memoir point of view of someone with your experience and your background, I think it's really vital for the current political, social climate that we're living in. So,
thank you.
What feedback have you gotten since the book has been out?
Well, it depends. It's interesting because in the US, so far the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and people were very accepting, very curious about what those people who I'm interviewed or who I present in this book, how they were thinking. People were actually very thankful and grateful that the book came out, and I received really positive feedback from all kinds of people. I found also interesting that in Europe, to a certain extent, I had some positive feedback. I had amazing coverage in Germany as well. I mean, the media coverage in the US and in Germany was amazing. However, and I think it has a little bit to do with the current political situation in Europe, the increasing of populist movements and of anti-Muslim sentiments. I received also some threats, unfortunately, from people in Germany and especially in the Netherlands. Personal threats, people who, for example, said, why are you as a Muslim daring to basically trying to teach us in Europe or what we have been doing wrong, and why are you talking about discrimination? And so that was quite interesting to see how different the audiences were.
Was that surprising to you, getting that negative feedback or getting that kind of push, or is that something you were expecting?
I mean, look, I understand that this is an interesting time also, and a very, very crucial time when it comes to the situation in Europe. We have, if you look at the moment in Europe, we have a rise of populist ideas and anti-Muslim sentiments. You just have to look at the elections that happen throughout European countries. So I understand also from personal experience, and I mentioned some of those experiences in the book, that some people, they have an issue with a person of Muslim or Arab descent trying to challenge them on an intellectual level. So somebody who actually has been through experiences, who interviewed some of the most wanted people in this world, and who grew up in the West, but who also understands the mindsets in the Middle East or in the Muslim world, and who works for an American news outlet. It's a very unique perspective.
And I think that's why the book is so important, because you're sort of in between. You have a foot and hand in all these different worlds, and you're coming from a place of understanding everything. And I think that's why this book is so important. What was the process like for writing not only your experiences as a journalist, but also weaving in your life, in your childhood?
That was quite challenging for me, because usually I don't like to talk about myself and my life and how my work has affected me. So it was a choice I had to make. And I think it was important to explain to people who I am, how I grew up. And to a certain extent, the feedback I also received from people in Europe or in the US was, well, it's so interesting to see that in Morocco, when you lived there, your neighbors were Jewish and you played with them, and that there was this exchange between my grandmother and our Jewish neighbors, the way my grandparents and my parents taught me Islam, how I understand the religion, the fact that we are descendants of the Prophet's family, but in the same time when I went back, when my parents took me back to Germany, I went to a Christian kindergarten, and this, you know, the way my family preached to us the religion, and that it's something where we have to look at what we have in common with other people and not what is dividing us necessarily. Yeah. So it was a choice I had to make because I believed it's important for people to understand this is also what happens in Muslim countries, and to understand what experiences I had been through. And that even though I faced you know, discrimination, I was still in a situation where my parents told me, don't look just at what is negative, look at the positive people in your life as well. Look at, okay, there were some people in Germany who didn't like us, fine, we know that. But there were also a lot of people who are fighting for us. And I describe, for example, in the book, the situation when in Germany the houses of Turkish migrants were burning. And back then, it was the Jewish community who stood up for the victims, right? And because we didn't have any person representing the Muslim community. And I think it's important to tell all those stories because people forget, unfortunately, also that this is part of the truth. Then the writing process for me was sometimes so difficult. It was difficult because, I mean, you read the book, you see that I have been through some very, very harsh experiences. I have been through experiences where I risked my life or where I was put in danger unintentionally. And when you write the book and you try to write it in a way that you take the reader with you on this journey, you have to also explain how you felt when you went through these experiences. So it also meant that old wounds were opened again. You know, the old traumas came back. And I had moments in the writing process where I just said, I can't finish this. I just can't. And then, you know, the last chapter was the chapter that came as a very, I would say, negative surprise, because it wasn't supposed to be the last chapter. In fact, I was on my way to Morocco. I wanted to go with my parents on a trip together and visit the old sites where my grandparents from my father's side came from. When we learned that a shooting took place in Munich, and because the shooter was described in a way that some of us thought maybe it is related to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, my boss asked me to postpone my trip to Morocco. I had already packed my bag and everything, and to go instead to Munich and cover this. So I went to Munich, and I learned throughout this journey to Munich that my cousin's son was missing. And I learned that night that he was killed, that he had been killed, and that he was one of the first victims of the shooter.
That was so heartbreaking for me to read that, because it all of a sudden takes you out of being the journalist covering this, and that you're an Arab and you're a Muslim, and that you have to deal with this on a different level. Well,
it was so shocking because, first of all, I mean, just the fact that before I learned that he was one of the victims, I was reporting on all of this. I reported on the incident, and then I was the first one in the family who learned that he had been killed. And I can tell you, you know, I have been through a lot in my life, but the moment where the policeman asked me to call my cousin and to tell him to come to this area where we were all waiting and where the police was gathering all the families, and not to show him that I knew his son was killed, was one of the most difficult things I had to do in my life. And I mean, this phone conversation, I mean, I was absolutely devastated like the rest of the family, but somebody had to call him and to tell him, come back, without showing him that his son was killed, because we needed him and his wife, my cousin's wife, to be in the area surrounded by the family. We had to make sure that they would not be, somewhere where nobody could take care of them. It was one of the most difficult things I had to do in my life.
I think it just proves your resilience as a journalist as well, having to put that hat on where you're having to speak to your cousin and not tell him that. I think it's beyond belief to me.
It was one of the. I knew at that point. I mean, as much pain as I felt, it is nothing compared to the pain those parents will feel and will have, and what they have to face and what they will have to go through. So it was also, and it brought back all the old stories, of parents I had to cover, or of who had lost their children. I've been to Iraq, where I dealt with the situation of a young man, Anas. Certain names you never forget in your life. It was one of those moments. I was in Iraq, in Mosul. Actually, it was the day Saddam Hussein's sons were killed, and we wanted to leave Mosul the next day. It was quite. There was a lot of tension in the city as well, and then somebody came. I will never forget that. I was outside the car and made a phone call with the satellite phone. Those big phones that. And somebody came and really tipped my shoulder and said to me in Arabic, "Hal inti sahafiyya? Are you a journalist?" And I said, "Yes." And I looked at him and he said to me, Why is nobody reporting about the young boy Anas who was killed yesterday by American soldiers? I said to him, "Excuse me, what are you talking about, a young boy? The only people who were killed was Saddam Hussein's sons." He said, "No, Anas was killed too." And I said to him, "But how do you know this?" And he said, "Because he was my brother."
And this is something that I think it was a question that came up to me when I was reading your book, is that I think especially for the Arab man, he's either an ignored victim or he's painted as this terrorist in the West. And it's such a juxtaposition between those two things, and you're either or. It seems like there isn't a balance for us in the middle. So I guess my question to you is how we can sort of bridge that gap. I think for a lot of Muslims in my generation, 9/11 was a very tipping point. It was a crucial time for us. But then reading your experiences when you were young and living in Germany and having experienced racism, it seems to me like, well, it's been happening for a very long time. I don't know if it's gotten worse. How can we now, who are living in the West or who are even living in the East, how can we tackle this issue of representing ourselves positively, that we're against these atrocities, but we're still Arab or we're still Muslim?
First of all, I think by having an open and honest discussion about the things that are going wrong as well, and about how come some people are getting radicalized, what are the reasons, because nobody was born like that, okay? I mean, as you can see in the book, I describe different characters, different biographies of men and women, and I describe the circumstances which led to their radicalization. That's number one. And I'm saying this, I'm telling this to people, saying this to people in the West as well, as I think we should have the discussion here in this region. What are the reasons for radicalization? What are the mistakes? What kind of mistakes are done by us as a society? Why are recruiters able to win over the hearts and minds of certain people? And I believe it's because we don't allow certain, and I mean on a global level, we don't allow certain discussions to happen. I guess we do need to have this kind of debates. We have to allow them, and we have to allow people to challenge each other on an intellectual level, which means discussions. That's number one. I think also there has to be a clear kind of idea on a global level about when people speak on behalf of Islam or of any religion and they preach certain things that we all believe are not really part of our religion, we need some kind of institution that will speak out and will basically clarify and say, but listen, actually, this is not how what the religion really says.
I think that's a key point that you just said there. It's so important.
It is so important because we don't have that.
Yes.
And the other thing is also, frankly speaking, we need role models. We need, and yes, I know there are some amazing people all over the Arab world who are who have achieved a lot of things on all kinds of level, but we need role models on a different level, and I think much more also on a level where people say, wow, look at this, there's somebody who actually really worked hard and was able to achieve something.
This is something that I think your perspective will be very important on, and a lot of these young men who do these crazy things, who were raised in the West, if it's Europe or if it's in the States, I think time and time again when I've researched this, a lot of these people's families are surprised, their neighbors are surprised that this young boy would do this or go down this path. So how can you as a family, as parents who are raising Arab and Muslim children in the West, protect your children from going down that path?
You know what is very important also to understand is, and I'm explaining this in the book, for many years people were able to but to set up some kind of foundations in Europe, and under the pretext of this foundation they established some prayer room, and just somebody who spoke a little bit of Arabic called himself sheikh or imam. And this happened a lot in the 70s and in the 80s in Europe. And for many years, the European societies didn't really look into, wait a second, who's actually preaching there? What are they preaching? Where are the books coming from? And so on. And I mentioned in the book, I had interviewed several, for the book also, members of Arab intelligence services and also members of Al-Qaeda and then ISIS or Daesh and the Taliban, who told me, you know what, for many years in Europe nobody cared. We were just preaching this. And the interesting thing is the members of the Arab intelligence service told me, we told the Europeans for many years, guys, you have people there who are under the pretext of freedom of religion are preaching an interpretation of Islam which is really, really violent and it's dangerous. And European services or politicians refused to take action because they said, you guys are just against our kind of freedom of speech. Now that's very important because for many years people were able to spread hatred and to preach some kind of radical view under the pretext of, that this is what Islam really is, and would tell those young men and women, and some of whom came also from the region as students, who studied in Germany. I mean, 3 of the 4 9/11 pilots got radicalized in Hamburg. And so they would even tell them, the Islam that was preached in the countries of your origin is not the real Islam. We're going to tell you what the real Islam is. And it was a very violent interpretation, or even, political. Yes. Right? I mean, they used Islam.
Charged and radicalized.
They used Islam in order to actually tell them, you have to take action and, you have to participate in the text. Now, you raised a very important point, because I found myself in the living room of a father whose 2 sons were killed in Spain when, during the trial of attacks in Ripoll. And I asked this man, I said, didn't you see that your sons got radicalized? And he said, no. I mean, aside from the fact, we saw each other in the evenings, we had dinners and so on with the family, but I didn't see anything. And I told him, okay, let me ask you the following. Did they at some stage come home and tell you that you are not a good Muslim because you don't really keep your prayers, you don't pray 5 times a day on time? He said, yes. I said, okay, fine. But did they come in the next stage and tell you that your Islam, the interpretation or the way you live Islam, or the Islam you learned from Morocco, is not the right Islam? He said, yes. How do you know that? And I said, okay, in the next stage, did they come and maybe tell your little son that he shouldn't watch TV, that he shouldn't shake the hands of women? And did they tell their sisters that they shouldn't shake the hands of men, that they shouldn't actually go out uncovered, that they shouldn't eat this, eat that? So I went with him point by point through all the things, and he said, yes. How do you know this? Yes. And
so there are red flags.
There are red flags. Yeah. The problem was, this man and most of the families, they don't know what the red flags are. And it's not about that somebody comes and says, you know what, you should actually maybe pray 5 times more often and 5 times a day. That's not an issue. That's not necessarily a red flag. But certain other behavior issues, the point where he told me, he would no longer really, he would tell us that this behavior is haram, this is halal, and he would mention a couple of different things that they would tell them the Islam you learn in Morocco is not the real Islam, and I will teach you. There are different things that are red flags, and I think it's important to equip parents with those red flags. The problem is, let me tell you what a big challenge for parents at the moment, Muslim parents, is in Europe. When you have a situation where populists and right-wing political parties are bashing left and right on your religion, and you have children who are growing up and who are born in Europe and who no longer know whether they can be both Muslim and European, because they have the impression that everybody hates the religion. I mean, that's how they see it. It's not the truth, it's not real. I still live in Europe and there's many good people there. But those people, some of those young men and women who are on the way of radicalization, they feel they cannot deal with the criticism in a way that maybe you and I and others would deal with. So it's very challenging for parents to keep, to not, how can I say this, to explain to their kids, not everybody is bad.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the recruiters are using the situation. So this whole momentum of anti-Muslim sentiments
is actually
in Europe
benefiting them.
Is helping recruiters. And it's for parents even more, and for, I think, also Muslim societies, even more important to equip parents and to equip societies with a possibility to fight also, the argumentation of recruiters. So it's important that parents talk even more with their kids.
Again, this theme of open dialogue and open communication seems to be so important in all the different levels in terms of creating awareness about this massive issue.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I believe so, and I think it's also interesting. One of my previous books was a book for kids about Islam, and I started this book it was in German, and I started this book with this whole story of who the first person was who knew that Muhammad, the boy, would become one day a prophet. And trust me, a lot of people don't know that it was a Christian monk. And or, for example, sometimes when I sit with some of those people who joined Daesh or Al-Qaeda, and I ask them, are you aware when you surround the Kaaba that whose footsteps are there? And they look at me and I said, no, think about it. Whose footsteps are there? And then they realize the footsteps of Abraham. Yeah. And I say, okay, and he was the forefather of whom? I tell you, it does sometimes make people think. So I think it would be important as societies to also remember and to make sure you equip the children from an early stage on with this knowledge. And but also, frankly speaking, I believe that the societies or also decision makers have to sometimes raise those issues also and talk and allow these kind of discussions to happen. Why don't we discuss again the whole question of double standards? Why can't we raise them with some people? And so I think it's important, because you're taking away the arguments from the recruiter. You
just mentioned when you were having discussion with some of these people from Daesh or Al-Qaeda, and I want to ask how you maintain a balance from when you're discussing these issues with them, from questioning them and challenging them, where you don't push it too far, where you're putting yourself at risk. I'm a reporter. My job is to talk to all the different sides and to listen to them, but also to challenge them, no matter whether it's somebody from Daesh, Al-Qaeda, from the intelligence service, a president, a minister, a king, it doesn't matter. It's, that's my job. Sometimes I describe a situation I had with an ISIS commander, and we were
at some stage we had like a back and forth discussion because he had a similar background, and
in the beginning of the that
book.
Riveting chapter, like that's amazing.
The prologue, and it's and I believed it was important also to challenge him and to because I had a similar upbringing, and he was talking about discrimination, and I tried to explain to them, listen, I mean, you're not the only one who faced that, but that's not an excuse for what you're doing at the moment. It's not an excuse. It's because I actually told him, I said, you choose the easy way out. It would have been much more difficult to stay in Europe and to not fall into this kind of hatred and make your way. I mean, you to fight for a position and to become somebody. And there was a moment in this conversation where his hand went up to his pocket, and I understood, okay, you have to back off here, and you have to talk about something much more softer, because I knew he had his gun there. But I believed it was important to do this interview. I know, of course, I mean, when he and others told me to come alone to this meeting, that there is a risk I took, but I felt, it was 2014, it was a couple of weeks after the so-called caliphate was declared, and it was a moment where a lot of people we all had questions. Who are those people? What do they want? What are the aims? And so I felt it's important to talk to them and to understand from them what their aims was, but also what their aims were, but also to challenge them. And this is why I decided to go and do this interview.
Reading that prologue, I was so in admiration of and shocked by your bravery. But then afterwards, when I was thinking, where is she getting this bravery from? And then reading about your grandmother and living with her and the kind of woman that she was, I was like, okay, it makes sense. It makes sense where it kind of comes from. So would you say, I mean, I think it's very obvious that she was a huge role model for you and instilled you with a lot of this kind of strength and bravery. And I want to know, who are your other female role models within maybe your family or even internationally that you read about growing up?
Yeah. So within my family, I admire a lot also the stand my mother took when she married my father, even though there was a lot of pushback from her family. I mean, it was, as you know, my parents are from two different sects, and she really went for it and decided to get married to him, even though some members of the family threatened her. So I had a lot of admiration for her in that regard. There are a couple of people who I admired in terms of what they did, in what they achieved. I mean, Marie Curie, for example, as a woman in chemistry. Simone de Beauvoir, who is a strong figure. Fatima Mernissi. I think it's important for people to understand you can be a woman, you can be a Muslim woman, you can be an Arab Muslim woman or woman of Arab descent, and you can do this kind of work. You can go there and you can do this kind of work even though there's a lot of pushback. And interestingly, it was in Europe that some of my European colleagues were actually telling me, just go, why don't you go home and just forget about working on this, because those people won't talk to you, you're a woman. And so all these women I mentioned, and especially also my grandmother.
I loved your grandmother. I loved reading about her. I think she was so interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, she was a very strong woman, and I mean much stronger than me. And she was married. She had kids. She brought the kids up on her own. I sometimes think, wow, men must have been really strong back then, because they got married to such a strong woman. Yeah. She was such a strong character, and so it's these kind of women who inspired me, and I think I carry from each of them and all of them something. Yeah, I guess so.
That definition of a terrorist has changed over the last 50 years, because now automatically people assume terrorist Muslim. So they're interlinked, those two terms. So I guess my question is, what is something that you think would surprise people? Since you've spoken and you've written about terrorists and extremists, what's something that would surprise people about them?
So first of all, the whole assumption that most of those people are, not educated. I hear very often, oh yeah, those are the, I'm quoting now, losers of societies and so on, who go and join these groups. And I say, well, there are some like that, but I have actually spoken to people who were highly educated. A lot of them, interestingly, were engineers and who joined these kind of groups, and who were so sure that, I mean, they saw themselves as victims, and that is very interesting and important, I think, to understand. A lot of those guys, or also women who joined these groups, they saw themselves as victims first, as victims of, victims of racism, as victims of the societies. There were people who would say that there is no, any country, any Muslim country in this world is basically just controlled by Western countries and so on, and nobody is really living the Islamic way. So they saw themselves as victims. The problem is that because they saw themselves as victims, they didn't see their actions or the actions they were taking as terrorism. They saw their actions as, we are just defending ourselves. And I think it's important to challenge that. Yeah. I guess for a lot of people, I received a lot of feedback in the US and in Europe who read the book. They said, we were surprised how, when we saw how they argued and why they became who they became, we understood much better that we never took on the argumentation, and we should have taken the argumentation on, because that would have maybe helped to challenge them, and to challenge them in their own self-perception as a victim. And I think that was a big surprise to people.
Yeah. Looking back now at the book, it's written, it's out there, it's, you're getting feedback. When you look at it and you look at the current situation, what do you see a hope? What is your hope?
I don't think we are dealing with a clash of civilizations, first of all, and I think that's a very positive thing. I think we're dealing with a clash between people who would like to build bridges, and it doesn't matter whether they are Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or whatever religion they have or not have, and those who actually want to divide us. And we can find those also in all parts of societies. And I talked about the populist movements in Europe. I'm also and we're talking, also of those organizations such as, ISIS and others.
I think even when you mentioned in the book when you were younger and your family's friends who were Yugoslavian, and then when that happened, I was so surprised to read this is happening now, and it happened then with completely different people. So I think that was really quite eye-opening for me.
It is, and I really hope that people, I was brought up that way, and I try whenever I'm lucky. I have amazing friends, I have amazing people in my circle from all kinds of religious backgrounds and beliefs, and I know there are people out there who would like to build bridges and who want to live in pluralistic societies, who are open-minded towards other religions, and who want to see those also in the society. And I think that's giving me hope, and that's as long as there are those people out there, I have hope. Yes.
We were discussing before that it's available in Arabic, and I think that's going to open up a whole another discussion for Arab speakers who are dealing with these issues.
And I'm very, very excited that it's coming out in Arabic, because this book, when I wrote it, I think it's also the story of our region. It's a story that talks about Europe. It's a story that talks about the United States, but it's also a story about our region, our part of the world, and about. And it was very important to me. It's very, very important to me to explain, to tell people, look, not everybody is against Muslims. There are a lot of good people out there who are trying to build bridges, And if you have grievances, and yes, you probably don't think of yourself as the only person who has these grievances. There are other people out there who had the same grievances, who have maybe even gone through more.
Yeah.
I grew up in an environment where I had to really work very hard for where I am at the moment, and I'm very proud of that. So I wasn't ashamed of cleaning floors, of doing babysitting jobs, of doing all kinds of work in order to pay for my studies. I supported my family. I've been through a lot to reach where I am. I felt a lot of resentments. However, it's possible to do that, and you can achieve things even if you weren't born into a rich family or into a famous family. And I really hope that this is also a book that shows that as a Muslim woman, as a woman of Muslim Arab descent, you can also reach somewhere in this world, and you can achieve things and work in a job or in a field where that is usually a field where people would say it's a man's world, and you can do it, and you can still be a woman. So yeah, I'm very excited about that.
I think for me, this book and another book, I'm not sure if you've read The Return by Hisham Matar.
Yes.
I think those two books for me, I was like, I need more of this. This is the kind of stuff that we as Arabs and Muslims need to read about and need to educate ourselves with. So on that note, I really want to make a point to say that you risk your life to report these stories, and I think that's so commended, and I really want to thank you as a young Arab Muslim. I've told all my friends and my family to read your book. I think it's imperative, so thank you so much, not only to sit down for this interview, but also to put your life at risk for the greater good, and to build those bridges. So on a last question, I think I want to ask you something that you wrote about what your grandfather said, which I have written here. He said that the people with power are the ones who write the history. I think that's so poignant, and it's so important to remember that. And I would like if you could just talk a little bit about that statement and how you think you writing as well as helping to add to that history.
This book is dedicated to my grandparents, my parents, and my siblings. And my grandfather was in the resistance, in the Moroccan resistance, and he lost all his lands. I mean, he was actually a very wealthy man. He was a tribal chief, and my grandmother came also from a very wealthy family. But you read in the book why they lost everything. I mean, my grandfather faced prison. He really believed into the independence that Morocco one day will achieve independence, and he was threatened by back then some of those French occupiers that if he wouldn't work with them, they would take away his lands and put him in jail. And he decided to go to jail and not to give up on the idea. And
I thought that was so powerful as a personality and as somebody with I don't want to say pride, but I guess pride for the country and the ideology. I think that's amazing.
Absolutely. He, as a child, when I lived in Morocco for 3.5 years, my grandparents told me all these stories, and they stuck to me. And and I'm actually getting tears when I talk about this, because see, my grandfather, when you have grandparents or people you look up to who are telling you they faced torture, and I could see the marks, and they were still people who didn't spread hatred. They weren't people who said, "Oh, yeah, go and hate the French because that's what they've done to us." No, they were people who were telling me you have to look at people from the perspective as who's a good person, who's a bad person. It doesn't matter what religion was, what background, but they struggled so much, and they had still this positive attitude. And then at some stage, my grandfather told me those people, the most powerful people, are going to be those who can write down history, because our stories will never be told, and it's only the story of the other side. They will create their own story, and our own story will never be told. And for example, a lot of people don't know that. And he told me that with a lot of pride. He said, we fought together with our Jewish brothers and sisters against the French occupiers. A lot of people don't know that, but it's a fact in Morocco and in other places too. So it was important for me, as being my grandfather's and my grandmother's granddaughter, and being a journalist, to write this history down, because I feel it's not the story only of my grandparents. This whole region, I mean, how many people in today's age really know about how difficult it was for nations in the Middle East or in North Africa to get independence? Do people really understand what it meant for our grandparents to go through all this suffering? Do we really understand what it means to live in a country where you, even though not everything is great, and yes, maybe not everybody is the richest or whatsoever, doesn't matter, but a country where you know, wow, you grandparents went to prison for that. They risked their lives and they all fought for it. And that, in fact, again, we have to look at what we all have in common, and instead of like fighting, you know, all this whole question
of divides,
divides for what? For what? And so that's why this book is dedicated to my grandparents, my parents, and my siblings, but to all the people of their generations too.
Well, I'm sure they would be very proud. And I think before, when you're talking about role models, I think it's great that people like you are around for a lot of young Arabs and Muslims to look up to. So thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm getting a bit emotional. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And I wish you also good luck. It makes me very happy to see people like you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. I was so happy to I was so happy to know that you were here and I got to meet you. I've been telling my whole family I'm so excited today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're cool? We're done? Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.